Hi guys, this is Weasel for PokerVIP.com. Today we're going to be talking about database analysis and how we can use Holder Manager 2 to increase our efficiency at the table. We're also going to be thinking about what the average stats of a winning 6-max player are. We'll find that as we move up limits, database analysis becomes an especially important tool. We may even be able to get away without looking too deeply into our database at the lower limits. But certainly if we want to compete at the higher levels, it's very important that we subject our strategy to an in-depth database analysis. Today we're going to be looking at some of the basic stats that we need to check using our tracking software, and although we're going to be using Holder Manager 2 for these examples, similar things can be done with Poker Tracker 4 also. So without much further ado, we have a database here submitted by a PokerVIP.com user, and one thing we can do straight away is we can check the graph of this player, and we can see that we have 120k hands in the graph. This player is down around about 45 buy-ins over this sample, so slight losing player. Also, we can check as well the blue lines and red lines here, which are going to give us some indication of the type of strategy our opponent is following. Certainly at the lower limits, it's very common for us to have a negative red line and a rising blue line. As a rough guide though, if we are following a negative red line strategy, we probably don't want our red line to be lower than about minus 10 big blinds per 100 hands. So we can see here in this case that Hero is down 150 buy-ins over only 120k hands. So the cutoff point would be down about 120 buy-ins, or 12,000 big blinds, would be roughly minus 10 big blinds per 100 hands. So the red line being lower than this generally indicates that there are going to be some issues with post-flop play relating to non-showdown winnings. Generally, if we are going to have a negative red line strategy, the blue line should also be significantly higher than this. Blue lines even upwards of 20 big blinds per 100 can be the case if we have a negative red line, which should result in a decent overall positive win rate. So it looks like both the blue line and the red line could use some work here. It's not necessarily an issue that's related to specifically the red line or the blue line. Whereas sometimes when you analyze these two lines, you may find that most of the problems are related to the red line or most of the problems are related to the blue line, in which case it can make solving your problems a little bit easier. In this case, the problems are likely divided evenly between the two lines, so we can't necessarily say it's a red line issue or a blue line issue. There's just problems with the overall game plan here. The next stage after we've checked out the graph is, of course, we can check by stakes as well. We can see the breakdown of various different stakes that our hero has played by going to the by stakes tab. At the moment we're just seeing the results in big blinds, and certainly if we have the results in winnings, which you can modify here in the bottom left, then the graph is not necessarily going to look that smooth if we have a variety of different limits in the graph. So one way we can easily ascertain how Hero is doing over the course of his hands without worrying too much about the stake is by setting the output to big blinds here. So every buy-in won or lost is equal in terms of big blinds regardless of the stake played, so it makes it a little bit more coherent looking at the graph with the big blinds option set. The next thing is to notice this More Reports tab here, and the report that I recommend mostly is if you go to Leakbuster here, and you see there's this one called Leakbuster by position. And the reason this report is especially useful is that it breaks down hero stats by position. So we can see in the left column here we have small blind, big blind, and the other 4 positions, which ideally for the level of detail required for database analysis, we really need to break down everything by position. When you first arrive at this report, you'll find that you don't have as many stats added as I do at this moment, unless you have specifically added some yourself. So the first step after you've added this report is to include some more stats in the output. And then this is generally going to be the main place you come when you're thinking about reviewing your database. There are other tabs we can make use of, but this should be our starting point here, the Leakbuster position tab. The way we can add more stats to this report is clicking on this stats icon in the top left here, where we will get a pop-up window showing us all the available stats we can add. So for example, if we wanted to add certain flop stats, then we click on flop and we see all the available flop stats here in this column. We just double click to add them, or we click on this left arrow if we want to add the stat to the output here. We can also use the search box here to find stats more efficiently. Then once they're in this output here, we have the ability to change the position they appear on the output using these up and down arrows here. I've already added all of the stats that I think are most relevant for analyzing a 6max database. So ideally you want to add all the stats you can see on this list here. Once this is done, we can start by looking at the main stats. The number one stats we're going to check first are VPIP, PFR, and we can see in this case here it has a VPIP of 20.5 and a PFR of roughly 16. So this player is playing on the tighter side. There's nothing super wrong with these stats. Probably average stats for a winning 6max player are 23-18 or so, but they can be more aggressive than this, especially if they're adopting the approach of completing a wider range of hands in the small blind. So standard 6max approach from a few years back generally includes raising hands from the small blind, so either raising first in from the small blind when it's unopened facing us, or just folding, whereas a more modern approach to the small blind these days is thinking about incorporating a completing range where we think about maybe completing 70% of hands in the small blind and having a limp call or limp raising range. And assuming we're following this kind of strategy, we're going to find that our VPIP goes up compared to an average reg, because an average reg is probably raising about 36% of hands in the small blind by default, whereas using a complete strategy, a completing strategy in the small blind, we can start by completing a 70% range. So we would automatically expect our VPIP to go up. So it wouldn't be completely uncommon for a winning reg to have stats like 27-20, for example, assuming that they were playing a completing strategy in the small blind. So 20.5, 16 are here as VPIP and PFR. Nothing wrong with these stats, but they are a bit on the tight side, which may indicate this player has some issues specifically in late position. The next place we can look to ascertain this is the unopened preflop raise percent. So the percentage of the time we decide to raise first in from each of the positions when it's folded round to us. So we can see early position, raise first in, is 12.7, should be about 13%, so this is pretty close to what it should be. MP raise first in should be about 18%, and we can see here it is raising about 14.5% here, so he's not raising as aggressively as he could be from MP, so that's going to have an effect on his overall VPIP and PFR also. Unopened preflop raise from the cutoff generally should be about 26, so here it is actually very aggressive from the cutoff in this particular situation. And the thing that is a little bit strange about these numbers is when we look at the button, let's just say we should probably be raising 48% of hands at the absolute minimum by default against any unknown blinds. Whereas assuming we're taking advantage of blinds who fold a little bit too much to button raise first ins, then we should potentially be opening 55, even 60% on the button. So the thing that doesn't purely make sense with these numbers is cutoff is very aggressive in terms of stealing, whereas button seems very passive. Small blind is also literally just above the threshold for what we should be opening by default. We should probably have about 36% raise first in, assuming we're following a raise first in strategy by default. And then assuming we run into big blinds who fold too much versus small blind steals, this number could easily become 40%, even 45%. So there's a few inconsistencies with these numbers. Certainly in terms of stealing, here we might be able to attack more aggressively from the button in the small blind. You'll also find this improves his VPIP and PFR. Moving on now to 3-bet, which is the next stat I generally check, we can see Hero has a 3-bet of 4.62%, which is certainly reasonable, but it's definitely on the low side, and one way this player can think about increasing their overall win rate, their overall red line, and also their VPIP and PFR is by looking for spots to 3-bet more aggressively in position. Overall, I would recommend that a winning 6max player has a 3-bet somewhere between about 7 and 9%. In some cases, we might get away with having a 3-bet more aggressive than this, and in some cases, we probably want to be a little bit more passive. It does depend on the games to an extent, but as a rough guide, somewhere between 7 and 9% is good. So here it has room to increase his 3-betting frequency in this particular situation. As a rough guide by position, we can probably be 3-betting around about 3% from MP, 3 to 4 even, depending on the games we're playing. Cutoff, we can have a 3-bet of around about 6%. Button should be somewhere between 8 to 10%. And 3-bet from the blinds should be somewhere around 8%, so they can be a little bit lower than the button, but they still want to be somewhat high. And we can see there's a little bit of an inconsistency here because the small blind 3-bet of this player is 8.1, yet the big blind 3-bet is 3.5. So we can see he's pretty passive from the big blind in terms of 3-betting as well. That might be something that we have to look at a bit more closely. So I'll give you one trick we can use for this kind of situation for spots where we have maybe missed a 3-bet. We go to more filter options here, and this is the place we're going to go when we want to run the majority of our filters. There is a position and action tab here which allows us to specify hero's position. Let's put hero's position on the button. We can specify the preflop action facing hero. Let's imagine we're facing one raise. Let's imagine that raise's position is the cutoff. So run the button, we're facing cutoff open. The trick we can use here is we go to the common filters tab. We can put VPIP equals no. VPIP stands for voluntarily put in pot. So by selecting VPIP equals no, we're basically telling holder manager 2 we're not interested in seeing any hands where we decided to actually play. So we are immediately cutting out any spots where we cold call against this cutoff open, and any spots where we 3-bet. We're purely looking at situations where we fold the button versus a cutoff open. So this is a useful trick for finding spots where we could have maybe 3-bet more aggressively but didn't. Make sure you check this drop down box here and choose all hands, because otherwise it will only show you 250 hands by default, and we have 2,845 hands where we folded on the button to a cutoff open. The next thing we can do is filter by card strength here, and we can see that there are some hands here, stuff like ace queen, ace jack, which we should probably be defending. When there's only 2 hands, or there's only one of each, it can easily be a misclick. We can see there's a reasonable amount of ace 10 offsuits, ace 9 offsuits. Some of these make pretty good 3-bet bluffs, button versus cutoff. Any suited ace we see as well can often make either a very good 3-bet bluff or a cold call in this particular case. Some of the offsuit kings are pretty useful as well. Like probably won't be folding these hands by default, button versus cutoff. Things like king jack offsuit make a very good 3-bet bluff, button versus cutoff. And we can see there's a ton of king jack offsuits here. So these can't all be misclicks. There's a bunch of king 10s, king 9 suiteds. So you can run this filter yourself and you can see if you are missing any 3-bets. And it's not just these 2 positions. You can also go back to more filters and you can change the positions. For example, you could specify we are in middle position and raise's position is early, for example, and see which hands you could have maybe defended in that particular situation. So you want to run this filter for the various different situations. If we now click here where it says clear filters, we'll get back to the default output. Let's look now at our cold call numbers. So we can see overall Hero has a cold call of about 10.6%. A winning 6 max player usually has a cold call closer to 12 or maybe even 13%. So immediately we're seeing that Hero is probably not cold calling as much as he could pre-flop. Generally speaking, in terms of position, we should find the later our position, the more we can cold call. So MP cold call should be the lowest, probably somewhere between 6 or 7. Whereas cutoff cold call can be higher than this, maybe 8 or 9%, and button cold call can be the highest, maybe 10%, maybe even higher. As for the blinds cold call, it's fine for the small blind cold call to be very low. We probably don't want to cold call that much from the small blind. But the big blind is the place where we want to cold call probably much looser than we imagine is profitable to cold call. In fact, for the overall cold call percentage from the big blind, it should at least be above 20%, and ideally it should probably be something like 25%. We can also run filters to check specifically versus a late position open in a very similar way to how we did before. So let's, for example, put hero's position, small blind, big blind, and let's say we're facing one raiser, and that raiser's position is the button. In this particular situation, big blind versus button, we should probably be cold calling about 31% or so. 31% would be the perfect amount versus a 2.5x open. So if you're playing in games where your opponents are routinely opening to 2 big blinds for a min raise, then you should probably be cold calling more than 31%. In some cases, if they were opening more than 2.5x on average, then you would obviously cold call less than 31%. But the way the games are going these days, it's more common for players to open 2.5x or smaller from the button, it's a lot less likely you're going to see a 3x open as standard at any given network. We can see here that Hero's cold call, big blind versus button, is 15.4, which ironically is not actually any higher than his overall cold call percentage, which is very strange because for a start we should obviously be cold calling much wider from the big blind when we're facing a button open compared to an open raise from any other situation. So assuming we filtered now for big blind call versus MP open or under the gun open, we should find that our cold call percentage is significantly lower in these particular situations. Also, if we look at 3-bet numbers as well, because we mentioned Hero's 3-bet from the big blind is somewhat low, we can see his big blind 3-bet is about 7%. His small blind 3-bet's very high, it's about 14%, which is fine, and this is partly a function of the fact that he doesn't cold call much in the small blind, so he's tending towards 3-betting his small blind when he wants to defend rather than cold calling that much. Big blind 3-bet versus a button open could easily be above 10% though. So just because we're cold calling very much in the big blind doesn't mean that we don't also want to 3-bet aggressively. What we'll find is since we can cold call so many hands profitably, remember we want to cold call at 31% range here, we'll probably find that our 3-bet bluff range becomes pretty weak because we're generally going to be 3-bet bluffing the hands which are outside our cold calling range. Another thing we can check for as well, given that Hero's big blind 3-bet is so low, we can also check for facing a raise from the small blind, because in this particular situation we should probably be 3-betting around about 15%. So let's check how much Hero is 3-betting big blind versus small blind. We can see he's 3-betting 4.49 in this particular situation. So one way he can easily increase his overall 3-bet frequency from the big blind is taking advantage of this specific situation. Small blind opens, we should probably be 3-betting about 15% of hands. Actually, as a rough guide, we should defend about a 50% range in this particular situation in the big blind facing an open raise from the small blind. So what this means is our cold call number and our 3-bet number should equal roughly 50% with this specific filter run here. And we can see that Hero's cold call is 18.3, which is very, very tight when you think about big blind versus small blind, how wide some guys open small blind these days. Some guys are opening like 60 or 70 or even 100% of hands for the small blind these days, which is not necessarily a good strategy, but some players are pretty wide. Also, we're guaranteed to have position post-flop. And also players are open raising smaller these days. It's not like they're open raising to 4x from the small blind every time. They're often min raising or making it 2.2 or 2.5. So as a rough guide, we should have a cold call of about 35% here. So in this particular case, Hero is literally cold calling about half what he should be in this particular situation, which is going to be very bad for our red line because we'll find most of our red line losses come from the blinds. And one way we can significantly increase our red line is by focusing on how we play from the blinds. So as a rough guide, 35% cold call here, 15% 3-bet, you should be doing pretty well. Other thing we want to do as well in this particular situation when we do cold call is we want to raise flops pretty aggressively. And it's the same for the previous filter we ran as well. We want our flop raise C-bet. In late position should probably be close to 20%. And we can see here, Hero does have 20% flop raise C-bet, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's following a correct strategy, and the reason is the hands he's raising at the moment, let's imagine he just continued to raise those hands and at the same time he decides to increase his cold call frequency to 35% and he carries on raising the exact same hands. Well, since he's now seeing flops much more frequently, his flop raise versus C-bet is going to go down. So he may find that once he's increased his cold call percentage to 36%, maybe his flop raise versus C-bet drops to 10% or something, and then he needs to start raising more aggressively on flops. So if we clear the filters again and go back to the main filters, and we'll just check that stat overall, the raise versus flop C-bet. So it should be about 15% here. And we can see that Hero is raising flops somewhat aggressively. It's actually over 15%. But his cold call is a little bit on the low side. So what we may find here is that when Hero starts cold calling more hands, this flop raise versus C-bet number is automatically going to go down. Actually, this 18.8 is not so common for the average player, definitely at lower limits. It's much more common when I look at players' databases that they have a flop raise versus C-bet of maybe 6 or 7%. And one way they can increase their red line and increase their win rate is by looking for more spots to check raise as a bluff, and overall this stat should be about 15%, but when we're talking specifically about a late position battle, it can be as high as 20%. So let's check out these three stats here, which are related. Went to showdown, $1 at showdown, $1 win saw flop. Very often we can actually troubleshoot someone's entire game plan just looking at the relation between these three stats. So in this particular case, 1 win saw flop is about 44.7. This is a stat that is most closely associated with the red line. So we'll often find that if we have a $1 win saw flop significantly less than 50%, then it's definitely going to be affected by a red line. We can see Hero has a reasonably good $1 at showdown, although given that he has a pretty low went to showdown, we might expect this number to be higher. So this particular number is most closely associated with the blue line, but there is some crossover. So $1 at showdown can obviously affect the red line, and 1 win saw flop can obviously affect the blue line. So they're not necessarily only affecting the red or blue lines. They both have an impact on the overall strategy here. But if I was to make a guess at what's going on, I would say that when Hero gets to showdown, he's doing reasonably well, because he mainly has the best hand when he gets to showdown, but he's folding slightly too many hands along the way. Now this would definitely be the case of someone who purely had a problem with their red line. So if you, at the beginning in your graph, you saw your blue line was very good, but your red line was the line that suffered, you'd probably find that your 1 win saw flop was very low, maybe even lower than this, maybe even 41% or 40%. But you'd probably find your $1 a showdown was very high, maybe like 58%. What we'd probably expect to see here is a higher $1 a showdown, given that we don't win very much when we see a flop, so we're obviously folding a lot in this case. So the fact that $1 at showdown is only 51.6 given this 1 win saw flop, which is way too low, we can basically see represented that Hero has issues with both his red and blue lines. So even though his $1 at showdown is too high anyway, we would actually expect it to be higher, given that he has a pretty low win to showdown. Win to showdown should be about 25%, and he has a low 1 win saw flop, which should be about 44.7. So again, the low win to showdown can be associated with giving up too much in certain situations post flop, which is again associated with having a low red line. So the next place we can look is the fold versus Seibert Stance. Generally speaking, if the flop fold versus Seibert is above 40%, then we are going to be slightly exploitable. We don't necessarily need to worry too much if we see our flop fold versus Seibert is 45% or something, but keep in mind that if our opponent makes a 2/3 pot Seibert against us, it only needs to work 40% of the time for him to make instant profit. So technically, if we're having a fold versus Seibert over 40%, we are actually exploitable. Ideally, this number will be below 40%, but can sometimes be tricky to get that extra 10% off this number to keep it nice and low. But the overall trend is Hero is folding a little bit too much to Seiberts. Flop fold versus Seibert is 43, turn fold versus Seibert is 53. Actually, the river fold versus Seibert is pretty low, and there could be two reasons for this. Firstly, it could be related to Hero folding too many hands along the way and getting to the river with a reasonably tight range, but also could potentially be related to him calling down too wide in some spots, which can affect the blue line. River call efficiency, we can see, is 1.38. This is a somewhat interesting stat because theoretically it should be 1, but actually if this value of the stat is 1, then we'll probably find that we're actually not playing optimally, because it means we're not playing exploitatively. So the game theory optimal value for river call efficiency is 1, and the meaning of river call efficiency is the amount of dollars you make for each dollar you invest on the river. So for every dollar Hero invests on the river, he makes $1.48. Now in terms of pot odds, we should ideally make $1 for every dollar we invest on the river, because if we start making money for each dollar we invest, it means we're not calling down in some situations where we have the pot odds to call so. However, exploitatively, we don't necessarily want to be calling in certain situations, and the ideal value for river call efficiency is actually somewhere around about 1.4. So probably if your river call efficiency is 1, even though that's a balanced game theory value for river call efficiency, it probably means you're calling down too wide on the river. Whereas if your river call efficiency is 1.8 or so, it likely means that you are playing way too tight on the river. So despite what we've said about Hero's game, his river call efficiency looks somewhat reasonable at the moment. So let's check now fold to 3-bet stat. This is a very important stat and is associated with the red line as well, especially if the number is very high. So keep in mind that as a rough guide, if we fold more than 67%, then our opponent can make automatic profit with a 3-bet with any 2 cards. And in reality, even if we fold a little bit less than that, even if we're folding 62 or 63%, our opponent can probably still make automatic profit, because if we just call versus 3-bet, he gets to see a flop some percentage of the time, and he gets to flop 2-pair and some strong hands. So we can see here 72.5 is a little bit on the high side. I don't think this is going to be a huge leak, but the number probably should be lower. Hero is probably folding to too many 3-bets at the moment, which is going to impact on his red line. So there are probably some situations where he can 4-bet more aggressively. So that's one way we can defend in this situation. We can see Hero's 4-bet range is 1.55%. When you think actually that aces is 0.45%, aces and kings is 0.9, and Hero has 1.5, he's probably hardly ever 4-bet bluffing. So one way he can decrease his versus 3-bet fold frequency is to incorporate more hands in his 4-betting range. And average for a winning 6-max player is probably something like 5% 4-bet range. Somewhere between 4 or 6 anyway should be pretty reasonable. 6% might be a little bit too aggressive, but certainly 4% should be decent. And in terms of filters, we can actually, in fact, there's even just a quick filter that you can use. If you go to more filters, you'll see there's a collection of quick filters in the bottom right, which are very useful because they're some of the main filters we're going to be using. And you'll see there's actually just a fold versus 3-bet filter here. So what we could do, if we had time, was we could add this filter by clicking on the plus. Then we could see exactly which hands Hero has been folding to a 3-bet. We could see if any of those were actually correct 4-bets, or whether he could be flatting wider in some situations. We won't run the filter now, but certainly if you are following along with your own tracking software, then I recommend you do this if you see there's any numbers that look suspicious. Versus 3-bet fold should probably be around 60%. So if you find your versus 3-bet fold is in the low 50s or below 50, you probably may have 1 or 2 issues. Whereas if you find that it's significantly above 65%, then you probably have some issues as well. So it wants to be somewhere in the middle. Next, we'll have a look at the continuation bet stats. Generally, if we're doing this correctly, we'll find that flop c-bet frequency is the highest, turn c-bet frequency is the second highest, river c-bet frequency is the lowest. In terms of game theory, we should probably be c-betting around 55%. But actually, especially at the lower limits, it makes sense to c-bet more aggressively than this. And the reason is because, as we mentioned, the average player is probably folding slightly too much versus flop c-bets. Many regulars have a fold to flop c-bet of over 50%. So the way we can exploit this is by c-betting a little bit more than is considered optimal. So I do like to see a flop c-bet frequency of somewhere between 65 and 70%. If it's over 70%, then you may find that you are having some issues with your overall game plan. You might find you're not defending your checking ranges correctly, etc. So as a rough guide for these stats, we can have flop c-bet of round about 65, turn c-bet of maybe 50, 52, 53, and then river c-bet of the lowest being, maybe 45% or something. Should be pretty good. So often when we see this river c-bet higher than the turn c-bet, probably means we're missing some good spots to 2-barrel, because if we double barrel a little bit more frequently, we'll get to the river with a wider range, we'll fire the river less frequently. So in this particular case, Hero might be missing some decent double barrel spots. In terms of win rates by position, the most important ones are the blinds and the button. You'll probably find you don't have a super high win rate from early position MP, which is fine. But in terms of blind win rates, you should probably have at least minus 15 VB per 100 from the small blind, and because the Hero has minus 25. And from the big blind, we can see Hero's win rate's pretty bad here. It should be about minus 30 big blinds per 100. If you want to find out what effect this will have on your overall win rate, we can actually add up the difference between what our win rate should be and divide by 6, because we see each of the blinds 1 in every 6 hands. So here, small blinds, roughly, let's just say 10 if we look at the EVBV per 100. So about 10 here and about 30 here, lower than it should be. Okay, so that's about 20 here, so about 30 total. So if we divide that by 6, we can see the impact on the overall win rate if we improve our blinds play in this particular example is about 5 BB per 100. So actually the blinds play here is going to be the difference between being a slight loser and a winning player. So if we fix a blind play, then we have probably a win rate of about 2 BB per 100. As far as the button goes, we want our win rate to ideally be at least 35 BB per 100, I'd imagine. I would say 40 BB per 100 is a good guide here. And we can see here it has 23.69, so also button play is going to be somewhat important as well in improving Hero's win rate. One way we can start is by 3-betting more aggressively from the button. So we've covered most of the stats. I think we didn't look at squeeze. Squeeze is similar to 3-bet percentage. We can see here it has a squeeze of 2.24, so he's primarily squeezing for value. He's missing some spots to bluff squeeze. So these are just the main stats, and this is just one report we can use. There are other reports that are very useful also. Just to give you an example of one kind of report you can run, which I find very useful, is this hand groupings hold'em report here. So this breaks down all of the hands into the different types of hand categories we can play pre-flop, so i.e. things like suited aces, suited connectors. You'll see in the list, so other non-suited hands, non-suited one-gappers, non-suited two-gappers, etc. It has the whole list, all the way from pocket aces down to offsuit two-gappers, etc. The way we can use this output very effectively is we can go to more filters and we can go to common filters and put VPIP equals true. And the reason we do this is because the main reason we play any hand in no limit hold'em is because we expect it to make us money. So if a hand's not making us money when we voluntarily decide to play it, then that may indicate we have an issue with certain types of hands. You can see here that Hero actually has primarily green numbers, although his win rate is very low with suited connectors, so it might be that he is having an issue with the way he plays his hands, or it could be variance, etc. But this can be a useful filter to run. You may find that any numbers in red could indicate problem areas. Not necessarily, it does depend on the sample, and it's not necessarily a huge problem if your win rate's slightly negative, because keep in mind that especially if you defend from the blinds, you're going to start out at a loss anyway. So if you can actually just lose less money from the blinds, you're still improving the win rate overall. But as a rough guide, there shouldn't be too many red numbers, or there shouldn't be any red numbers when you run this filter. So if you find there's any red numbers, then probably indicates you want to filter a little bit deeper into which hands are causing you problems. So the way you could do this is, okay, so maybe there's a problem with suited connectors, perhaps, maybe not, but maybe there is. So we bring up the graph here, the whole cards grid, and you can see specifically which hands are costing Hero the most money. So you can see Queen Jack suited appears to be causing him problems over 309 hands. Maybe he's misplaying Queen Jack suited, some of these lower suited connectors as well. But certainly the bigger sample, the less he's going to be affected by variance. So it looks like there isn't a super clear trend here or anything. But you can break down the filter even further. For example, when you go to more filters, there's the option to filter by whole cards. So you can filter specifically by the hands that are costing Hero money. And then once this filter is applied, you could go back to the position tab and you could cross-reference it against position. So for example, we know we're losing money with Queen Jack suited. Are we losing money with Queen Jack suited in any specific positions way more than we are other positions? So just to show you how this would work in practice, and obviously you probably wouldn't do it as one specific hand, you do it with a range of cards you think are causing you problems. But let's just do Queen Jack suited as an example for how you can expand your search. So you can use this option here, apply to reports. And then you can go to the position tab once you've clicked this, and you might find stuff like this hand is not making money in early position when Hero open raises or something. So we'll probably find, especially you can see that Hero's making a profit from the cutoff but losing from the button, which probably indicates that we don't have a big enough sample size here for this to be an effective filter at this stage. But certainly we can review individual hands. You could, for example, click on the button and you could go to the net one column and you could check out the biggest losing pots and see if they're misplayed, for example. The other filter we could look at as well is this report up here in the top left, Leakbuster Preflop. And remember, all of these reports you add by clicking on more reports here. So we can see that the same filter is applied, and we can see in what type of situations we're losing money. So it seems like we're making money when we play against a raiser and a caller, but it seems when the pot's unopened that we're not making money, which is strange because we probably should be making money, and we're not making money against a raiser either. In fact, our win rate seems to be significantly worse playing against a raiser. So we can break it down into these different categories. And what you could even do is, if you wanted to look purely unopened situations, you could go back to the Leakbuster position tab. You could go to more filters, position and action, preflop facing Hero, unopened. Then you can see which kind of situations is this hand not making you money when you open raise from. And you can see actually that MP seems to be the, maybe the issue is, as mentioned, maybe these hands are not making so much money from early position. So you can trial this stuff yourself, and what you'll find is the reason why these are affected by variance so much is because we've just picked one hand, Queen Jack suited. Whereas ideally when you do this, you'll have a range of hands you use, you'll have a bigger output, and you'll be able to narrow down the problem more specifically. So hopefully this has given you some ideas of how you can work with Holder Manager 2. We've just scratched the surface of the features that this software has. So there's many additional things that we can do with this software. But hopefully you have a rough idea of the stats of a winning 6-max player and how you can use Holder Manager 2 to check for these. So I hope it's been useful. Thanks very much for watching. This has been Weasel for PokerVIP.com.